The icy waters of the Delaware River churned black beneath the moonless sky, as General George Washington stood at the bow of the lead boat, his weathered face set in grim determination. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled against the bitter cold of December 25th, 1776, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. The Revolutionary cause hung by a thread thinner than the ice forming on their muskets. Washington's army was dying, not from British bullets, but from something far more insidious despair. The defeats at Brooklyn Heights and White Plains had shattered morale, and the humiliating retreat across New Jersey had left his force a shadow of its former self. Men deserted daily, their enlistments expiring with the dying year. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, and even Washington's most trusted advisers whispered of surrender, the general's eyes fixed on the far shore, where the Hessian garrison at Trenton lay sleeping off their Christmas revelries. Colonel Johann Rall, the town's commander, had dismissed reports of American activity with characteristic arrogance. "These country clowns cannot whip us," he had declared just days before. His 1,700 mercenaries, flushed with victory and holiday spirits, had grown complacent in their winter quarters. But Washington knew what Rall did not, that desperate men fight with a ferocity that comfort cannot match. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Cross the ice-choked Delaware in the dead of night, march 9 miles through a blizzard, and attack at dawn. 3 separate columns would converge on Trenton simultaneously, trapping the Hessians in a steel vise. It was the kind of gamble that could save a revolution or bury it forever. As the first boats pushed off from McConkey's Ferry, Washington felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Thomas Paine's words echoed in his mind. "These are the times that try men's souls." The pamphleteer had written those lines just days before, and Washington had ordered them read to every regiment. Now, as sleet began to fall and the wind howled across the river, those words seemed prophetic. The crossing took longer than expected. Ice floes battered the boats, and the storm intensified with each passing hour. Men wielded poles and oars like weapons, fighting the river as fiercely as any enemy. Some boats were swept downstream, their occupants struggling against the current. Others became trapped in ice, requiring backbreaking effort to free them. According to historical accounts from the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, the weather conditions were so severe that 2 of the 3 planned crossings had to be abandoned entirely. Only Washington's main force successfully reached the New Jersey shore, but even they were 3 hours behind schedule. Dawn was breaking as the last soldiers stumbled onto the bank, their clothes frozen to their bodies. The general surveyed his bedraggled army with a mixture of pride and concern. They had conquered the Delaware, but the hardest part lay ahead. 9 miles of treacherous roads stretched between them and Trenton, and every step would be taken under the watchful eyes of Hessian patrols. The element of surprise, their only advantage, grew more precious with each passing minute. As the column formed up and began its march through the howling storm, Washington rode among his men, his presence a beacon of resolve in the darkness. He knew that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of his army, but the destiny of a nation struggling to be born. The storm that had plagued the river crossing now became Washington's unwitting ally, as the Continental Army struggled through the pre-dawn darkness. The howling wind and driving sleet created a natural screen that masked their approach. The 9-mile march from the ferry to Trenton transformed into an ordeal that tested every man's resolve to its breaking point. Washington divided his force into 2 columns for the final approach. He would lead the main body down the Pennington Road, while General Nathanael Greene commanded the second column along the river road. The plan called for both forces to converge on Trenton simultaneously, sealing off all escape routes before the Hessians could organize a coherent defense. The roads had become rivers of mud and ice. Men slipped and fell repeatedly, their muskets clattering against the frozen ground. Many soldiers had wrapped their feet in rags, having long since worn through their boots. Bloody footprints marked their passage, a crimson trail that spoke of sacrifice and determination. Officers moved constantly along the column, encouraging stragglers and helping those who stumbled. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, rode beside his commander through the storm. The young artillery officer had insisted on bringing his battery across the river, despite the enormous difficulty of transporting cannon through such conditions. Now, as they approached their objective, Hamilton's guns would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. The Hessian outposts that should have detected the approaching Americans remained huddled in their shelters, unwilling to venture into the storm. Colonel Rawls' dismissive attitude toward American military capabilities had infected his entire command. Sentries stayed close to their fires, and patrols were canceled due to the weather. The very conditions that tormented Washington's soldiers became the cloak that concealed their advance dot as the eastern sky began to lighten. The outskirts of Trenton came into view. The town lay spread before them like a sleeping giant, its streets empty except for the occasional Hessian sentry moving between buildings. Church bells had not yet rung the morning hour, and smoke rose peacefully from chimneys throughout the settlement. The scene possessed an almost pastoral quality that belied the violence about to unfold. Washington called a halt just outside the town limits. His officers gathered around him, their faces etched with exhaustion but burning with purpose. The general's voice was steady as he issued his final orders. "Remember, this is our moment. We have but one chance to strike. Let every man do his duty, and victory shall be ours." The password for the operation was victory or death, words that perfectly captured the desperation and determination of the Continental cause. There would be no retreat from this battle. Success would revive the revolution. Failure would likely end it forever. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing, the synchronization of the two-pronged attack was crucial to the plan's success. Any delay or miscommunication could allow the Hessians to escape or, worse, mount an effective counterattack. The fate of American independence hung in the balance as the final preparations were made. The storm continued to rage, but Washington saw providence in the weather. The same sleet that had made their march a nightmare would prevent Hessian reinforcements from nearby garrisons from reaching Trenton quickly. Nature itself seemed to conspire in favor of the American cause. At precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26, 1776, Washington gave the signal to advance. The Battle of Trenton was about to begin, and with it, the turning point of the American Revolution. The ragged Continental Army, driven by desperation and led by an unshakable commander, prepared to write one of the most dramatic chapters in military history. The first shots echoed through Trenton streets like thunder on a clear day, shattering the morning calm and announcing the arrival of American vengeance. A Hessian sentry, stumbling through the sleet-covered streets, spotted the approaching Continental column and raised his musket. His cry of alarm pierced the air. "They're fine. They're fine. The enemy. The enemy." Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led the vanguard as it swept into the town's northern outskirts. His men moved with the precision of clockwork, despite their exhaustion from the night's ordeal. Behind them, the main force spread out along King Street and Queen Street, the two main arteries that would become the axis of American victory. The Hessians, roused from their warm beds by the unexpected attack, stumbled into the streets in various states of undress. Many had celebrated Christmas with perhaps too much enthusiasm, and the wine and beer still clouded their judgment. Officers shouted contradictory orders in German while their men struggled to form ranks in the chaos of the narrow streets. Colonel Johann Rahl, the Hessian commander, had been playing cards until nearly dawn and was slow to respond to the crisis. When he finally appeared, sword in hand and uniform hastily donned, his forces were already being overwhelmed by the coordinated American assault. The man who had boasted that country clowns could never defeat his professional soldiers now faced the reality of Washington's tactical genius. Captain Hamilton's artillery proved devastating in the confined space of the town. His guns, positioned at the head of King Street, poured grape shot into the Hessian formations with murderous effect. The narrow streets, which should have favored the defenders, became killing grounds where the Americans' superior numbers and positioning told decisively. Every attempt by the Hessians to organize a counterattack was broken by the thunder of American cannon. The battle raged with surprising intensity for such a short engagement. Hessian officers, displaying the courage for which German soldiers were renowned, tried desperately to rally their men. They formed squares in the town center, their bayonets glinting in the gray morning light. But the Americans pressed forward from all sides. Their recent defeats transformed into fuel for their fury. Private John Greenwood, a young fifer in the Continental ranks, would later describe the scene. The Hessians were completely surprised. They came running out of their houses and huts, some with their weapons, others trying to dress themselves. Our men gave them no quarter, driving them through the streets like sheep. The Battle of Trenton unfolded with remarkable speed. Within an hour of the first shots, organized Hessian resistance had crumbled. Colonel Rahl, attempting to lead a final countercharge, was mortally wounded by American musket fire. His death effectively ended any hope of a coordinated defense, and his surviving officers began to consider surrender. Washington, mounted on his white charger, rode through the battle like an avenging angel. His presence inspired his men to superhuman efforts, and his tactical directions kept the attack coordinated despite the chaos. The general who had suffered so many defeats in the previous months now demonstrated the military genius that would ultimately win American independence. As documented in the New Jersey Historical Society's archives, the psychological impact of the victory was as important as the tactical success. American soldiers who had known only defeat suddenly found themselves the masters of a European battlefield. The myth of Hessian invincibility, carefully cultivated by British propaganda, lay shattered in the muddy streets of Trenton. The remnants of the Hessian garrison, trapped between the two American columns, began to lay down their arms. White flags appeared at windows throughout the town, and the sound of gunfire gradually diminished. Washington had achieved what many thought impossible, a complete victory over professional European soldiers. But the general knew that winning the battle was only the beginning. The true test would come in the hours and days ahead, as the Continental Army faced the inevitable British response to their audacious strike. The smoke of battle still hung over Trenton's cobblestone streets when Washington faced his greatest challenge, yet not from the enemy, but from his own men. Victory had come swiftly, almost miraculously, but now the harsh realities of war reasserted themselves. The Continental Army had won a battle, but could they hold their prize? The tally of victory was impressive by any standard. Nearly 900 Hessian soldiers had been captured, along with their artillery, supplies, and regimental colors. American casualties were remarkably light, only 2 soldiers killed and 5 wounded, including a young officer named James Monroe, who would later become the 5th President of the United States. The psychological impact far exceeded the material gains. But Washington's triumph was shadowed by an immediate dilemma. His men were exhausted, having fought on no sleep. After the grueling night march, the captured Hessian supplies included casks of rum, and some Continental soldiers had already begun to sample their spoils. Discipline, always precarious in the citizen army, threatened to dissolve in the euphoria of victory. More pressing was the strategic situation. British forces at Princeton, just 12 miles away, would surely respond to the attack on Trenton. General Charles Cornwallis, the British commander in New Jersey, commanded thousands of regular troops who could overwhelm Washington's small force. If given the opportunity, the Americans had perhaps hours. Before enemy reinforcements arrived, Washington's officers were divided on their next move. Some, including General Greene, urged an immediate retreat back across the Delaware. They had achieved their objective, a morale-boosting victory that would help with recruitment and demonstrate that the British were not invincible. Why risk everything by remaining in an exposed position? Others, led by the ever-aggressive General Hugh Mercer, argued for pressing the attack. The British were off balance, and a second victory might drive them from New Jersey entirely. The Continental Army had momentum for the first time in months, and momentum in war was often more valuable than numbers or supplies. The general himself seemed torn between caution and audacity. He had risked everything on the crossing and attack, but now faced the eternal military question: when to consolidate gains and when to press forward. The decision would shape not just the next few days, but potentially the entire course of the war. As the morning wore on, disturbing reports arrived from American scouts. Cornwallis was indeed mobilizing his forces, and advanced elements were already moving toward Trenton. The British, stung by the humiliating defeat of their Hessian allies, were preparing a massive counterattack that would dwarf anything the Americans had yet faced. Washington made his decision with characteristic boldness. The army would withdraw across the Delaware, taking their prisoners and captured supplies with them. It was a practical choice that preserved his force for future operations, but it also reflected the general's growing understanding of the kind of war he was fighting. The American Revolution was not a conventional conflict where armies met in pitched battle until one side was destroyed. It was a war of endurance, where the ultimate prize went to whoever could maintain the struggle longest. Washington's genius lay not in seeking the decisive battle, but in keeping his cause alive through a series of calculated risks and strategic withdrawals. As detailed in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection of Revolutionary War documents, the evacuation of Trenton was executed with the same precision that had marked the original attack. The Hessian prisoners were ferried across the Delaware under heavy guard, while American soldiers loaded captured artillery and supplies on boats with remarkable efficiency. The Continental Army that recrossed the Delaware on December 26th was fundamentally different from the one that had made the journey 24 hours earlier. They had tasted victory and proven to themselves that they could defeat European professionals. More importantly, they had demonstrated that George Washington was a commander worth following. Regardless of the odds, the Battle of Trenton was over, but its consequences would echo through the remaining years of the war and beyond. News of the American victory at Trenton spread through the colonies like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope that had been all but extinguished by months of defeat and retreat. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress who had fled the city just weeks before began to speak of returning. In taverns and meeting houses from Boston to Savannah, men who had begun to doubt the cause found their faith renewed. The propaganda value of the victory was immense. Here was proof that the vaunted Hessian mercenaries, the same soldiers who had struck terror into American hearts at Brooklyn and White Plains, could be beaten by farmers and shopkeepers fighting for their liberty. The myth of European military superiority lay shattered in the muddy streets of a small New Jersey town, but Washington understood that one victory, however dramatic, could not sustain a revolution. The Continental Army's enlistments were still set to expire on December 31st, just 5 days away. Without immediate action, his force would simply dissolve. Victory or no victory, the general faced the challenge of transforming a tactical success into a strategic advantage. The British response to Trenton came swiftly and decisively. General Cornwallis, who had been preparing to return to England for the winter, canceled his leave and assembled the largest force yet deployed against the Americans. 8,000 British and Hessian troops began converging on Trenton, their commanders burning with the desire to avenge their humiliation. Cornwallis himself took personal command of the operation, declaring that he would bag the old fox once and for all. The British general was supremely confident, and with good reason. His force outnumbered Washington's by more than 3 to 1, and his troops were fresh, well supplied, and eager for battle. The trap seemed perfectly set. On December 30th, Washington made another of his characteristically bold decisions. Rather than remain safely across the Delaware, he would recross the river with his army and make a stand at Trenton. The move shocked his officers, who had assumed the victory would be consolidated by maintaining the river as a barrier. Instead, their commander was deliberately placing himself in harm's way. Once again, the decision was both strategic and psychological. Washington knew that remaining on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware would allow the British to maintain their grip on New Jersey. More importantly, he understood that his army needed to see him taking risks if he expected them to do the same. Leadership, he had learned, was as much about example as it was about orders. The second crossing of the Delaware lacked the drama of the first, but it was no less significant. This time, the weather cooperated and the army moved quickly across the ice-covered river. By December 31st, the Continental forces were again in position around Trenton, preparing for what everyone knew would be a climactic battle. As the year 1776 drew to a close, Washington faced his greatest crisis yet. Not only was Cornwallis approaching with overwhelming force, but the enlistments of most of his men would expire at midnight on December 31st. The army that had won such a dramatic victory just days before threatened to simply walk away. When their terms of service ended, the general's solution was characteristically direct. He assembled his troops and spoke to them as both commander and fellow patriot, according to accounts preserved in the Library of Congress. Washington's address was brief but powerful. "My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you." The appeal worked. Most of the soldiers, moved by their commanders' words and the promise of a $10 bonus, agreed to extend their enlistments for 6 more weeks. It was not a long-term solution, but it gave Washington the time he needed to continue his campaign. As referenced in the comprehensive study The Winter Patriots by historian Richard Ketchum, the decision to re-enter New Jersey transformed the American Revolution from a series of desperate defensive actions into an offensive campaign. Washington was no longer simply trying to survive. He was actively pursuing victory. The stage was set for the next act in the drama that would determine the fate of American independence. The first day of January 1777 dawned, cold and clear over New Jersey. revealing the chess match that Washington and Cornwallis had been playing across the frozen landscape. The British general, supremely confident in his overwhelming numerical advantage, had deployed his forces in a classic hammer and anvil formation, designed to crush the Continental Army. Against the Delaware River, Cornwallis commanded 8,000 of the finest troops in the British Empire. His force included seasoned regiments that had fought in Europe, fresh Hessian units burning to avenge their comrades' defeat, and the feared British light infantry who had terrorized American forces. Throughout the campaign, against this juggernaut, Washington could field barely 5,000 men, many of whom were militia with minimal training. The British advance began at dawn, with columns moving toward Trenton along multiple roads. Cornwallis had learned from the surprise at Trenton and was taking no chances. His scouts probed every possible route, and his main force moved with the inexorable precision of a well-oiled machine. The trap was closing, and Washington appeared to have nowhere to run. But the American commander had spent his lifetime studying military history and had learned valuable lessons from Frederick the Great and other masters of warfare. He understood that superior numbers were not always decisive. If the smaller force could choose the time and place of battle, the key was to force the enemy to fight on your terms, not theirs. Washington's first move was to deploy Colonel Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen as a delaying force. These marksmen, armed with long rifles far superior to the standard musket, began harassing the British advance from concealed positions. Their accurate fire from extreme range slowed Cornwallis's progress and inflicted casualties that were small in number but significant in their psychological impact. The running fight between Hand's riflemen and the British advance guard continued. Throughout the morning, every creek, every stone wall, every patch of woods became a defensive position that had to be cleared at cost. The Americans would fire from concealment, then fall back to the next position, leaving the British to count their dead and wonder where the next volley would come from. By afternoon, Cornwallis had pushed through the American delaying actions and could see Trenton spread before him. His confidence was unshaken. The Continental Army was trapped with their backs to the Delaware, and victory seemed assured. The British general deployed his forces for a final assault, planning to crush Washington's army in a single decisive blow. The assault began at sunset, with British and Hessian troops advancing in perfect formation despite the gathering darkness. Their discipline was magnificent, their courage undeniable, but they were attacking an enemy who had learned to fight on his own terms. The Americans, positioned behind hastily constructed earthworks, poured devastating fire into the advancing ranks. The Battle of Sunpink Creek, as it came to be known, raged through the evening hours. 3 times the British charged the American positions, and 3 times they were repulsed with heavy losses. The narrow front prevented Cornwallis from bringing his superior numbers to bear effectively, while the American defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nowhere to retreat. Captain Thomas Forrest's artillery battery, positioned on the American right, proved particularly effective. His guns, loaded with grape shot, swept the British ranks with murderous fire. The young captain, who had served with distinction at Trenton, continued to pour shot into the enemy formations even as return fire tore through his own ranks. As night fell, the firing gradually died away. Cornwallis, surveying the carnage before the American lines, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of the war. Rather than continue the attack in darkness, he would wait until morning to complete the destruction of Washington's army. "We've got the old fox safe now," he reportedly told his officers. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." The British general's confidence was understandable. Washington's army was trapped, outnumbered, and had suffered significant casualties. During the day's fighting, the Delaware River at their backs prevented any possibility of retreat, and British reinforcements were arriving early. By every conventional measure, the Continental Army was doomed, but George Washington was not a conventional commander, and the American Revolution was not a conventional war. As documented in the Pennsylvania Historical Society's archives, the general had already begun planning his most audacious move yet, one that would transform apparent defeat into stunning victory and change the course of American history. The longest night of the war was about to begin. The campfires of both armies flickered in the darkness as January 2nd turned into January 3rd, 1777. The British sentries peering across the lines. The American camp appeared normal, men huddled around fires, guards walking their posts. The usual sounds of an army in the field. But appearances were deceiving. What Cornwallis took for resignation was actually the most daring deception of the entire war. Washington had called a council of war as soon as darkness fell, gathering his officers in a small farmhouse behind the American lines. The situation appeared hopeless by conventional standards, but the general had spent months learning that conventional wisdom rarely applied to revolutionary warfare. His plan was audacious beyond belief: abandon the defensive positions under cover of darkness, march around the British flank, and attack the enemy base at Princeton. The logistics were staggering. The entire army would have to disengage from the enemy, march 12 miles through the night on frozen roads, and arrive at Princeton in condition to fight a major battle. All of this would have to be accomplished while maintaining the illusion that they remained in position at Trenton. It was the kind of plan that could only be conceived by a commander who had learned to think beyond the possible. The deception began immediately. A small force of Pennsylvania militiamen remained behind to tend the campfires and make noise throughout the night. They worked with clockwork precision, moving between fires and calling out patrol challenges to create the impression of a full army. Meanwhile, the main force began its silent withdrawal, wheels wrapped in rags and officers whispering orders in the darkness. Captain Alexander Hamilton supervised the removal of the artillery, a task that required extraordinary care. The guns had to be moved without the telltale sounds of iron on stone that would alert British sentries. Each cannon was carefully lifted and carried by hand until the army was well clear of the enemy lines. The young officer's attention to detail would prove crucial in the coming battle. The march to Princeton tested the Continental Army's endurance one more time. The roads were sheets of ice, and men slipped and fell constantly, but there was a different quality to this march compared to the desperate retreat across New Jersey. Just weeks before, these soldiers had tasted victory and believed in their commander. They moved with the confidence of men who knew they were making history. As dawn approached, the American vanguard made contact with British forces near Princeton. General Hugh Mercer, leading the advance elements, encountered a British regiment that had been marching to reinforce Cornwallis. The two forces collided in an orchard near the town, beginning a sharp engagement that would determine the fate of the entire operation. Mercer's men, caught in open ground by British regulars, began to waver under the enemy's disciplined volleys. The general himself, attempting to rally his troops, was surrounded by British soldiers and mortally wounded by bayonet thrusts. His death might have broken the American attack, but Washington himself appeared at the critical moment, riding directly into the midst of the fighting. The sight of their commander sharing their danger galvanized the Continental troops. Washington, mounted on his white horse and seemingly immune to the bullets flying around him, became a rallying point for the entire army. His presence transformed what had been a confused skirmish into a coordinated assault that broke the British resistance. The Battle of Princeton was over almost before it began. British units, caught completely off guard by the American appearance, broke and fled toward New Brunswick. The Continental Army, energized by their second victory in 10 days, pursued the enemy with a ferocity that surprised even their own officers. The hunters had become the hunted. Captain William Hamilton, serving with the New Jersey Regiment, described the scene. The British ran like sheep, throwing away their weapons and equipment. Our men, who had known only defeat for so long, now chased the enemy with wild enthusiasm. It was as if the very spirit of the army had been transformed. The material gains from Princeton were significant: supplies, weapons, and another boost to American morale. But the strategic implications were even more important. Cornwallis, arriving at Trenton to find his prey had vanished, now faced the humiliating prospect of chasing Washington across New Jersey, while his own supply lines remained under constant threat. As recorded in the definitive account by the American Historical Association, the Princeton campaign marked the true beginning of Washington's evolution. From a defensive-minded commander to an offensive strategist, the general, who had learned to retreat skillfully, was now learning to attack with devastating effect. The Continental Army that went into winter quarters at Morristown in January 1777 was fundamentally different from the broken force that had fled across New Jersey just weeks before. They had proven that Americans could defeat European professionals, that their cause was worth fighting for, and that George Washington was a commander who could lead them to ultimate victory. The Battle of Trenton had indeed been Washington's bold gamble, but it had become something more: the turning point that saved the Continental cause and set the stage for American independence. The revolution that had seemed all but lost in December 1776 was very much alive. As 1777 began, and the world would never be the same, the end.